Welcome to Total Retail Talks, your podcast channel for retail knowledge.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Total Retail Talks. I'm Joe Keenan, the editor-in-chief of Total Retail. I'm excited to be joined on today's episode by Matt Navarro, who is the global president of PMI WW Brands, the Stanley 1913 brand. We're going to talk a little bit about Stanley 1913, the transformation of that brand, its expansion into new product categories, new geographic markets, a little bit about what's to come from Stanley 1913. So, Matt, I'm excited to have you. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah. Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me and look forward to spending some time together.
So as I noted at the outset, one of the things that's been exciting about Stanley 1913 is the recent launch of a new product collection, the Vitalize collection, and it's really expanding beyond hydration into bags and on-the-go lifestyle products. So with that in mind, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how this new product launch represents, what it represents in Stanley 1913's evolution, and why now was the right time to make this move.
Yeah, I think we're a 110-year-old plus brand and have a real foundation in sustainability, in innovation, and in originality. Those are really the things that our brand is rooted on. And we're also very focused on sustaining growth beyond a viral moment or hydration revolution that the quencher caused over the last 3 or 4 years. And we've frankly been on just an incredible ride for the last 5 or 6 years. But one of the things that's important to us and important to our future is really diversifying our product mix, diversifying geography, and really becoming a global brand, and diversifying into different consumer segments. From a product mix standpoint, the quencher obviously remains iconic, but our strategy is really to expand past that, and mobility and storage and products that are just versatile for your everyday life. And meeting the Stanley consumer in more places throughout their lives is really what we look for in those adjacencies and extensions to hydration, which maybe we're most known for. Second is, diversifying beyond the USA. Our fastest growing regions right now are in Europe and in Asia. We're growing really fast in the UK, France, and Germany, in APAC and China, Korea, Japan, Australia. So have really become a global footprint with local relevance. And that's really been the key to our diversification strategy beyond the US and into global markets. And then last, it's really diversifying our consumer mix, which is understanding the consumer is how I would describe that. And once we understand, we follow the consumer. We understand they're constantly on the move. They're balancing work, play, passions. They really want products that fit seamlessly into their lifestyle. And so we offer that convenience without compromising style or quality. And it's really led to just being part of our consumers' everyday lives, which we're really proud of.
Do you want to take a moment and tell the audience a little bit? And hydration has been kind of the core product category for Stanley 1913, but this Vitalize collection, tell us a little bit about that for the audience that might not yet be familiar with it.
Yeah, so our next evolution really is introducing everyday essentials in backpacks and totes. The Vitalize collection is really a great example of our innovation and our originality, supporting consumers' well-being, fueling a life in motion. Life in motion is really what we root ourselves to and how the consumer behaves. And between the Vitalize shaker bottle, the backpack, the tote, the crossbody, and the carry-all, it's really built for moments that fuel you. As I said, we try to be really connected to the consumer. We try to understand the consumer. And these products are just places where the consumer can meet Stanley, or Stanley can meet the consumer in more places within their lives. We launched this week. It's been incredibly successful. The consumer response has just been fabulous on social and in other channels. And we really have just huge expectations for it.
So I want to follow up. You talked about the diversification as kind of different channels there. One, I'll start with product. And then as you expanded in new categories like backpacks and totes with Vitalize, does that then evolve? And how do you think about your distribution strategy and merchandising and telling the story of the Stanley brand? To use a word that you said, viral, in terms of the growth of the hydration market over the last 5 or so years. As you enter into new categories, does any of that kind of thought process around distribution and the storytelling behind the brand shift at all?
I'm glad you asked that. We're spending a lot of time on consumer experience and the consumer journey. So understanding where the consumer's shopping, how they're shopping, and what they expect from brands like Stanley. And recently within our quarter, our strategy is really following the consumer. So we're trying to understand where they shop. And then our job is to make sure we have the right product, right place, right price at the right time, and have a really curated assortment in those channels for the Stanley consumer to make sure that we are part of consideration, whether they're headed to buy a water bottle, a quencher, a backpack, or a tote. And so while I don't think that necessarily means extending or expanding our distribution, what our expectation is that retailers have a really premium experience of the Stanley brand and how we show up. And we're not just a wall of cups, as an example. And we're showing consumers use cases and how the brand can connect with consumers throughout their lives. That includes health, wellness, back to school, of course, things like going to the yoga studio, the gym, staying hydrated at the office. That's really what our expectation is of how we show up at retail. And of course, the most premium expression of our brand will continue to be Stanley1913.com and our direct-to-consumer channels around the world.
So the quencher product really was a cultural phenomenon. You've talked about the explosive growth that it drove for the brand. But now, as you think about the future, how do you sustain that momentum, build that enduring brand equity beyond that single hero product? We've talked about the Vitalize collection. There's other areas that you're expanding. What are your thoughts there, Matt?
It's beyond hype, right? We're now into year 6 of what we would call the 4th era in Stanley's journey. And it's really beyond hype and really rooted to our legacy and our longevity. We don't lean on legacy. We use it to fuel the next 100 years. And that's really what I wake up thinking about is how can we be great stewards of the brand and how can we set the company, the brand, and the business up for the next 100 years. And, we disrupted the market and led with hydration, I think, in a space that was ripe for disruption. But we did that also by really driving cultural relevance and a connection to innovation, lifestyle, entertainment, sport, to really become part of people's lives. And so as we continue to think about staying relevant, we also lean on our authentic partnerships, many that I'm sure you're familiar with that we've done with Barbie and Love Shack Fancy and Lainey Wilson and Olivia Rodrigo. And today we continue to forge authentic, impactful partnerships that also share that originality, that innovation, and resonate with consumers culturally. And staying relevant is really important to us. And some of our most important collaborations with folks like Post Malone, K-pop star Jennie, athletes such as Caitlin Clark are not only surprising and delighting the current Stanley consumer, it's also introducing our brand and driving fresh engagement to new consumers. As an example of that, the partnership with Caitlin Clark, more of half of the collection's purchasers were new to the Stanley brand. And so having those ways to make a gateway and an entry point to the brand is also something we're thinking a lot about.
Yeah, and I want to follow up. Your answer led me very nicely into the next question I wanted to get to, Matt, in terms of you talked about the next 100 years, right? That's what excites you. And how does innovation play into that in terms of continuing to pay loyalty to the brand's heritage, but also thinking towards the future and creating innovative products and innovative ways to tell the brand story? How does that factor into the way you operate and that commitment to innovation that can help fuel success going forward for the next 100 years, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are our anchors. One, Stanley is part of food and beverage culture. So as we think about whether it's innovation or category adjacencies and extensions, it's really being at the heart and being rooted in food and beverage culture. So when we enter sport, as an example, we didn't necessarily enter sport on the field or on the court. We entered sport through the fan experience and how people enjoy food and beverage around sport. Global football is a great example of that. In the pub prior to and after the game, in the stadium, fueling fans during matches. And so I think being rooted in food and beverage is one of the things we really hold core to who we are. Second is being rooted in sustainability. I like to say that Stanley was sustainable before sustainability was cool. It's much more than a PowerPoint slide to us. We are committed to leaving the world a better place than what we found. We are committed to eliminating single-use plastics. So our sustainability and social impact commitment is also not only a place where we innovate, but as we innovate, we keep that at the forefront of how we're innovating and what that impact is, both going to be to the business and then also to things like our carbon footprint. So those two things really provides the guardrails for me and the company to operate within, I think is a good way to put it. And then we try to find things that consumers don't even know they needed yet. Consumers didn't know they needed or wanted a 40-ounce quencher with a straw. Fortunately, people fell in love with it, and then the product and the virality took on a mind of its own. I think you'll start to see that also with Vitalize Shaker. Vitalize Crossbody is an interesting one because I think it's an innovation that is one of a kind and is new to the marketplace, which I hope will really connect and make consumers love us even more.
We've talked a lot about what Stanley is putting out into the market externally and kind of the sustaining of the momentum that has been generated and where you're going next. We haven't really talked a little bit about the internally, the operations standpoint and your role as president. How do you continue to think about evolving the business internally to sustain that growth? And then that extends from product development, which we've talked a little bit about, to marketing, telling that brand story, to the retail partnerships. There's many different buckets that you can touch on, but I'd love to know your thought process in terms of evolving internally to maintain this growth.
Yeah, I think there's really five things that I point the organization to. It really we title it Fuel the Future, which is really our five strategic priorities. One is remaining culturally relevant to consumers and being a lifestyle brand. And that lifestyle to us is life in motion. So as consumers move throughout their lives, how do we make sure we're presenting them the right products and things that will make their lives better? The second is really prioritizing consumer centricity. So that's using data analytics to really understand our consumer. And I think along the growth phase over the last 4 or 5 years, that's something that our company has done really well. And I think it's critical to the future success of the brand also. The third is that we continue to think globally. I mentioned this earlier, but we're certainly the leading hydration brand globally. Our fastest growing markets are outside of the US. And as our product assortment grows, we expect that international growth to continue to really fuel the company in the next 2 or 3 years for sure. And we're incredibly excited about that. And then last is, I think I referenced this earlier too, is follow the consumer and really meeting our community where they want to shop. And so we spend a lot of time, or I spend a lot of time thinking about where are consumers spending their wallet, where are they choosing to shop. And those are the places that we need to make sure we have a curated assortment and have the right proposition for consumers. That's in price point, that's in color, that's in use occasion. So we're spending a lot of time on meeting our community in the right channels at the right time, really through our merchandising arm and execution. So those are kind of the 4 or 5 things we're thinking about internally as how we bring the brand to life here in the short term.
I want to talk a little bit about your consumer. You've mentioned a lot of the recent growth and has been with female consumers. As you talked about more on a global scale, the entrance into sport a little bit. How do you think about broadening the consumer mix? You talked diversification at the onset of our conversation, and consumer diversification is part of that. As you look to, engage and bring more men and potentially younger global audiences into the mix, what's the strategy there, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's a delicate balance, Joe. One we think about a lot is expanding your consumer base and introducing the brand and the right product to new consumers, while also staying very dedicated to what I'll call the hardcore Stanley consumer of today. And I think one of the best examples of that is really our play into dialing up our active platform through sport. And so again, we don't think about sport necessarily of how athletes are fueling themselves on court and on field, but the food and beverage experience around sport is just incredible. We say caffeination to hydration to libation. Everything around sport and the food and beverage culture around sport is a space that we believe we can own. Again, that's the tailgate, that's the pub prior, that's the post-game meal, all those things that football fans, soccer fans around the world really serves as their passion. And it's a great place for us to meet them. The other thing that does, though, is also introduces us to consumers that maybe have not seen us previously within the hydration space. That's often a more male consumer. It's also, sport gives us a very wide demographic in age, right? We want to talk to the 15-year-old and the 45-year-old. And sport is a great place for us to talk to them and everyone in between. And you're seeing that through, launches like PSG that launched in December was incredibly successful. Our first one was actually Arsenal, arguably the most popular football club in the world. And the other one is, we were fortunate that Lionel Messi has been a Stanley brand fan since he was 10 years old, growing up drinking mate in Argentina. And so having those authentic partnerships rooted in sport, especially in global football, I think is a really cool way through the active consumer to connect with consumers new and old to Stanley.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that culture around food and beverage around sport, I'm smiling because I'm thinking of my own household and going to my son's games and whether it be baseball or soccer, or my daughter plays volleyball, and my wife, she would not dare to go to one of our kids' baseball games without her quencher, so she's always carrying that around and going to the different games, and you see it on the sidelines of youth sports all the way up to the professional ranks, right?
Yeah, 100%. And, it's part of just what's become people's daily lives, right? Like phone, keys, Stanley,
Water bottle. Yep.
and what folks are doing every day.
So
And
you
I
talk
would say, I would add just right there too, that like
Yeah,
the health
sure.
and wellness trend has really helped us also around just being fit and being well, being active throughout your life and hydrating. It was a bit of a gift, I think, for Stanley to be able to connect with consumers in that way and provide them solutions that help them achieve those goals.
So I did want to talk about international growth. You highlighted, obviously the brand is scaled and grew very quickly, particularly recently here in the US, but from Europe, the Middle East, Asia, LATAM, these are key geographic expansion opportunities. Tell me a little bit about what you're learning about your global audiences and the relevance that Stanley can have as a brand.
Yeah, it's timely. I spent a couple weeks in Asia in late January, and then I just got back from Europe last week. And we're really building. First, I would just give those teams credit. We're building world-class teams, and that's been a big part of our success. I often say I stand on the shoulders of giants, which means our bear force around the world, which is our workforce, is just incredibly talented, passionate, and committed. And that's showing up in a really big way today in Europe and Asia in particular. And some of the things we've found in those markets is many of those markets, draft off of North American culture. So we certainly are trying to find places that lean into North American culture as a trend. But I would also say, from a hydration standpoint, we're having to create the category in some parts of the world. Hydration in North America is a much more prominent, much more established category, both within retail and just within consumers' lives than it is in other parts of Europe. But as we've started to introduce new products, both in hot beverage cafe, obviously in hydration, but then also in mobility and storage, we're seeing really strong connection and reaction from consumers. Europe has tripled over the last couple of years. Our business in Asia, especially in Korea, Japan, and China, has more than doubled over the last 2 years. And so we'll see a very high percentage of our business be outside of North America, which I believe just creates a really healthy, diversified business portfolio as we can diversify in region, diversify in category, and diversify in consumer. A bit like we were talking about earlier, that's really, to me, probably the keys to success for us in the next couple of years.
And one of the ways that you're diversifying that global audience is through partnerships. Maybe just a minute there, Matt. You talked about some of the things, global brands, our Arsenal, PSG, these football clubs that are, followed all over the globe. Then you have, your partnership with Messi and other brands that you're part. So how does those, one, bubble up and come to fruition, and two, what do they mean for Stanley as it expands into these new markets?
Yeah, I think, one of the interesting challenges in Europe and Asia is that the retail marketplace is much more fragmented than what we're used to in the US and North America. And so while we have great retail partners in those parts of the world too, we do believe that we have to fuel that consumer demand, fuel traffic, and really create relevance, as we've talked about. And throughout sport in particular, football, golf, and basketball are really the three sports that we're leaning into. I would say because they all are global in nature, so they have global footprints, but they also have very locally relevant passion, right? Fan bases for PSG and Arsenal is, like I said, in golf, Nelly Korda, who's the number one golfer in the world, is carrying our bottle on course. And then we'll have some exciting basketball news that I can't quite tell you about coming up in March and into April. And so those global partnerships that we're able to execute locally with locally relevant content, locally relevant activations has really been the magic, I think, to drive that global growth through partnerships. I would also say we'll have another tease for you maybe is this summer we'll have a really cool connection, let's say, to the World Cup and elevated fan moments within Seattle and North America to connect and enrich the World Cup experience, which we're excited about.
Well, I want our audience to certainly be on the lookout for that. It'll be exciting this coming summer with the World Cup here in the US, or North America, Canada and
Yes.
Mexico as well are hosting some of the games. My final question for you, Matt, when I have leaders such as yourself on the show, I always want to kind of wrap up with getting your insights, getting your kind of wisdom, your expertise. For those in the audience that might be navigating sort of their own brand transformations and evolutions, much like you've done at Stanley 1913, are there particular lessons you would want to share from your experiences?
I think change and transformation are constant and necessary. As we continue to challenge ourselves as leaders, I would encourage our team to remain curious, to be able to be asking the right questions and observing and using in data and analytics to make informed decisions. And I think those two things are like really, really important for leaders today. I chuckle sometimes when people are like, I can't wait for it to calm down and for us to get out of this change or transformation phase. And I think that's really dangerous for companies because I think if you don't remain flexible and agile, and as a leader, you don't remain curious to understanding what's happening within your company and the business, that's a really dangerous place to be. So curiosity and continual transformation, I think, are the two things I would point to right now.
Right. There's not necessarily a finish line to transformation and innovation. It's just an ongoing,
That's
always
exactly
going to
right.
be happening or always should be happening, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the companies that don't do that are the ones, frankly, that really struggle.
Yeah. Stand still and you'll get passed by.
100%,
Um,
100%.
Great. Well, I want to take the opportunity to thank Matt Navarro, again, the global president of PMI WW Brands, which we all know so well for the Stanley 1913 brand. Matt, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for joining me on today's show.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, best of luck. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening. For more information on this podcast, please check out our podcast channel page at mytotalretail.com/podcasts for show notes. Total Retail Talks is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe on our podcast channel page as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a few moments to rate and review this podcast. Thanks, and until next time, this has been Total Retail Talks.